You clicked for gaming insights and struck gold. Welcome to Nothing Venture, Nothing Game. As always, I'm your host with the most, your GM Jared. And today, joined by the linchpin of fairness and our guardian of gameplay, Rules Arbiter Steve.
Yep.
We are diving into the basic review of the new Critical Role playtest for Daggerheart. So let's get straight into it. Daggerheart, if you don't know, is being created by Critical Role. Obviously, if you're watching this and you've been around the tabletop sphere for even about 15 minutes, you know Critical Role, a live action play of Dungeons and Dragons, but they've kind of moved into the realm of a lot of different tabletops RPGs. And this is Critical Role's long-term tabletop game through their publisher, Darrington Press. Basically, what Daggerheart is a simple enough fantasy, high fantasy tabletop system where you take 2d12, you build a character, and you go through an extended play period. There is leveling, different kinds of features, and we'll dive into that as we go through our full review.
No, just the fact they make mention that this is a more of a rules light narrative driven game, more so than the crunchier, 5th editions as / Pathfinders kind of game. It is more like those, like I said, narrative driven. Effectively, they even say that the GM isn't the only storyteller. Everyone at the table is a storyteller.
So let's dive into the crunchy bits. Now we're going to try and keep this nice and short, hopefully under 30 minutes. So we're going to dive into the crunchy bits and let's start moving through the playtest handbook. Now, first and foremost, understand when you get this playtest, you go to Darrington Press, or you could just Google Daggerheart, and it's like the first thing that pops up on Google. And basically, the zip file comes with both GM stuff, player stuff, and the rule book, as well as an included adventure path and, well, an adventure, right? I'm used to saying adventure path, but it's an adventure. It's a fully written out adventure and pre-generated characters. So if you want to just hop into it like right away, you could just use the pre-gen characters and kind of play through. So there is a lot of stuff, and this is a playtest, so rules will be changing as the game goes on.
They even make mention that the artwork is not finalized, the rules are still in flux. There may be spelling errors because their editor hasn't even gotten a hold of it yet, and that they're not really going to touch it until it's more finalized at this point. But they make it very clear that it is a playtest. Things could change. Hold on to your butts.
Yeah. So part one basically gets into preparing for the adventure. And what that is your character creation, learning about the classes, the heritage, the traits, and kind of like everything for your character to start building. Domains, and we'll jump into that, right? So let's start with the basic nitty gritty. The basic rules. This game, like I said, is run by 2d12. You need two different colored 2d12s. So you need like an orange and a blue one. The reason why you need the two different colors for the d12s is one will be hope and one will be fear, and that is an integral part of the system. The players will roll, or the characters will roll, and depending on what numbers show up on those d12s, determine if you succeed with hope or you succeed with fear. And like I said, those attributes affect what's going on. Hope is not just a thing that happens within the game, but it's also a usable stat that you can mark on your character sheet. Fear is something that GM can use later on or in the GM's turn. You will notice that the D20 is not used by the players, but it's specifically used by the dungeon master or the game master, whatever you want to call them, the rules arbiter, if you will. Then you have your D10s, your D8s, your D4s, and those are used for multiple different options. The D6 is used a lot because it is also your advantage and disadvantage system. So with that, you roll 2d12, and if you have advantage, you add a D6 of, let's say, orange is your hope color, so you want to use an orange D6. meaning advantage, and then you add it all together, and you probably will succeed with hope. If it's disadvantage, let's say it's dark blue, and you roll, and if that D6 is not added, it's subtracted from the total, and you'll more or less probably fail with fear. So that is the basic rolling system. It's not, not a D20 system that we're all recognizable with many of like like Steve said, Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder, this or even Dragonbane, which is one of our familiars. This is a 2D12 system, and you have modifiers, and modifiers come from different avenues. The system also uses the standard six stats. So your character traits or your stats are agility, which is dexterity, but it's like nimble, leaping, jumping, and stuff like that. Strength, your standard strength, like Hulk smash.
They kind of combine strength and con into one stat here. So that's
your
finesse, physical hardiness plus your physical strength.
Finesse is like your ability to like hide and be quiet and use like tools like escaping and stuff like that. Instinct is perception, sense, navigate. Presence is charm and your presence of like self, and knowledge is basic knowledge, like you're recalling information, comprehending stuff, analyzing stuff. So it's 6 stats that you're it isn't too far removed from your standard 6 stats that you've probably seen in Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or tabletop games. So after you have your stats and you assign your stat points, you have specific to your class, and this game actually revolves heavily around like what your class is, and that very much determines a lot of your other scores. So your evasion is how hard it is for enemies to hit you, which isn't your armor class. Armor class is something different. We'll get into that a little later. But your evasion is like how hard it is for enemies to hit you. That's determined by your class, as well as your starting threshold points. So if we're looking at Bard, their starting threshold is minor is 3, major is 8, and severe is 13. We'll get into that. All classes on the character sheets start with 6 hit points, right? And then as you level, you can add hit points and stuff like that. But all of them start with 6 hit points on the character sheet. So that's how basically those are your stats. So just quickly run down the stats and stats, stuff like that. With hit points, it's a different system. The way you are attacked is, like I said, the GM rolls the D20 and they see if it beats your evasion. And then you have to then look at your threshold. So if it beats a certain threshold, that is how much damage it automatically does to you. So let's say it's beat only the minor, but not the major, right? So it did 5 points of damage to you after your armor is soaked, then it has to exceed. The way I understand it, it has to exceed. And you will only mark off 1 hit point once you take that 3. So
a minor damage is 1, a major damage is 2, and a severe damage is 3. And for a bard to take a severe hit, they would need to take 13 or more points of damage in a single hit.
Exactly. There is no rollover. Me and Steve talked about this. There is no. So if a dragon hits you for 7 billion points of damage, you're only taking a major amount, and that's it. So you're just taking 3 hit points, and then you're
I count the excess. Damn it.
The dragon drops its whole self on you, and then a building, and you're like, 3 hit points. I gotta keep it moving. Armor in this game. So like I said, your evasion is your score to beat for the GM. Armor is basically soakable, and you mark off you'll see on the character box, there's an armor section, and then you kind of mark off as you go. Armor is repaired during short rest. So there's a short rest and a long rest system, and different things come back depending on what you're doing during when.
This is the sample sorcerer sheet that they have kind of already filled out, and you see there's an active armor section right there. And it's weird to see a sorcerer in breastplate at first level. It's really weird. I know that the system doesn't do armor the same way that the traditional fantasy, but seeing a sorcerer in breastplate armor I think it's kind of funny.
Yeah. There are standard levels, and there is also stress. Not all damage done to you will directly affect your hit points. It can also affect your stress. So that's a feature. Looking over the character sheet, and I guess this is a great place to like go through the stuff. You have your hope, and like I said, when you're playing, every time you roll and you succeed with hope, you get hope point. And hope points.
So let's kind of go back over before we start talking about getting hope. Let's understand how the 2d12 kind of functions. If you want to talk about that first, because then we're going to be talking about this a lot, and it might seem confusing to talk about what you get without knowing how you're getting it.
Sure, simple enough.
So with the 2d12 system, every time you roll a check, as Jared mentioned before, you have a hope die. You're setting like this one is the hope die and this one is the fear die. And you're going to roll both of those when you're doing anything in particular. So the GM says, well, I want to jump over the chasm. The GM says, okay, go ahead, make this roll or that roll or whatever. They'll tell you what's the skill to use, or you'll arbitrate yourself to what skill you're using. So every check, you roll both dice. And you may add some other stuff. But let's assume right now it's just a +0 and you're rolling your 2d12. The GM will assign a difficulty value to it, with the difficulty, whatever it is you need to succeed, and you roll both d12s and you add them together. And that is your total success amount to try to beat whatever the GM said that you have to beat. If your total combined number meets or exceeds the number that GM said, this is the difficulty, you succeeded. But depending on which one of those dice rolled higher, so if you rolled the hope die rolled an 11 and the fear die rolled an 8, you succeed, and then you, assuming that you succeeded with hope, because the hope was the higher of the two dice. Mm-hmm. If you succeed, but the fear die is higher, you succeeded with fear. And the same thing is, it works the same with failure. You can fail with hope and you can fail with fear. And then that really is the amount of major system. So anytime you succeed with hope, anytime you roll the hope die and that's the higher number, you gain a hope point. Mm-hmm. And then anytime you roll the fear die is being higher, the GM gets a fear token. Yes. And then those tokens are used throughout the game. Various things the GM can do with tokens, various things the players can do with tokens. But that's what we're saying with succeeding with hope or succeeding with fear or failing. That's what we mean. That's what we mean.
Yes. And that also ties into how this game works. There are levels of success. And coming from Pathfinder 2nd edition, we understand that.
And here, I'm just going to show up on the screen here the success/failure chart here that they have.
Yeah. And then, like, if I fail with hope, maybe I don't unlock it, but I did notice it was booby-trapped with an alarm. And if I failed with fear, I don't unlock it. I accidentally set the alarm off. And now we're going, and that's
you
more
broke
or less.
Your picks.
And I broke my picks. Yeah,
it's so like all bad. It's all bad.
It's just all bad at that point. That's like more or less a critical failure at that point. And so, like I said, and Steve mentioned, the fear tokens are in play when the GM moves, and the hope tokens are in play every time the player activates. So you'll see on the character sheet when we jump back to it, hope, you spend hope to use an experience or help an ally, and that's like kind of how you aid, and you spend those are constantly in play. Classes have other things that they can do with that, right?
There, I see hope. I was looking for it, I couldn't find it.
It's right under.
So as you see, hope is limited to 5 tokens per player. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's actually a maximum fear limit for the game master.
Infinite fear.
Infinite fear. Nah.
And then as you continue, right, you'll see underneath there your gold. Gold is actually no longer set up in like pounds. It's a really interesting system. I really liked it. It's set up in like handfuls. So you like have like a handful of gold, and then it's bags of gold because it's so much. And then it's like a chest, and then it's hordes, and then it's like fortune. So that's like, that kind of goes into like it's no longer like, oh, you have 10 platinum and 1 silver and 2 copper, and I need to break a copper. I only have 1 copper for the tavern keeper, or I only have 1 silver and the food was 5 copper. And now we're doing the constant exchange rates. It's all kind of gold. It's very simple to like understand, which I really like. I like to lean in the simple. Then you have your active weapons. They show weapons are done by hands. So if it's one-handed, it's a single-handed weapon. Two hands, have to use both hands to use it. You have your inventory, very, normal inventory weapon, inventory armors, because armor, like I said, it's expendable. So the concept is you might carry more armor until you get a short rest, and then that allows you to start to heal your armor as well as your health. So there are systems in play to like you are expected to constantly be using your armor as you play in combat. That's kind of an expectance. And that's
we've seen that system a lot in a lot of smaller RPGs where the idea is that armor is like a soak and eventually it either can break, or in the system it has to like basically recharge at some point, or you have to maybe do something to recharge it. So yeah, so it's not that we haven't seen that system before, but
yeah, it's a very simple system to understand. I personally think it's I like systems where things are always kind of in play. But that's just me, and we'll get into more of that. Then you go over then we could talk about the domains. Domains are basically features that make up each class. They combine the combination of two themes. Two of the domains form a basic for each class's abilities and like spells that you get, and which you gain cards as you go. So you kind of build like a deck. So it's kind of like a deck building game in a fashion. These are features that your class uses also. So as you're playing, you can play these out. Now, they don't go away. You can always kind of keep playing them. So it's non-expendable. And they're features.
Some of them are expendable.
Yes.
Some of them are like once every short rest, once every long rest. Some of them are just general passive benefits. Some of them you have to actively use, and some of them may have a cost inherent to using them.
And then they now have a system of swapping cards, right? Because you have a loadout, and your loadout is kind of what abilities you're taking with you. And then you swap your loadout from your, they call it your vault. And you can do that during a short or long rest. You don't need to, you don't really need to worry about like having a specific loadout for like a whole day or something like that. Like if you get a short rest, you can change.
You kind of do and you kind of don't.
Yeah.
So effectively, you don't actually have to worry about this until you reach level 5, because at level 5, you'll have more cards that you have access to than you have spots. You can only have 5 cards active at any given time. So at level 5, you probably have at least 6 cards, depending on your class. You may get more. And you have to basically, when you get your character ready, you pick your 5 cards, and then everything that is not that you have access to, that is not those 5 cards, goes into your vault, like Jared said. Now, during a short or long rest, you're allowed to swap cards for free. If for some reason you want to swap a card now in the middle of the adventuring day, you can actually spend stress to immediately swap that card. But again, you're gaining stress, so that's not necessarily a great thing.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting feature with how the domain cards work. It's another class ability on top of your normal class abilities as you level, because there are levels and you gain experience. And so that's the domains. And then we're going to get into the, I guess, the really interesting part, but also the not like the general, like I think this is the coolest part, cooler parts. So it's your heritage, and your heritage is kind of like what genetic creature you are, and your what's it called, and then your community,
your ancestry, basically.
Your ancestry. Your ancestry is kind of like I said, what genetic creature you are, and your community is your background, more or less. So if you're looking at D&D and you're coming from 5th edition, ancestry is race, and community is background, and that's it. So your classes are as follows. You have Bard, Druid, Guardian, Ranger, Rogue, Seraph, which is an interesting class, Sorcerer, Wizard, and Warrior. I totally put those out of alphabetical context for no apparent reason. And then when you choose a class, right, there are subclasses that you kind of build into. So if we're looking at
each one has 2 subclasses, I think.
each one currently has 2. So if you want to look at the bard subclasses are the wordsmith and what was the other one?
Troubadour.
Troubadour, yeah.
I know words.
Yeah. So you choose, if you're creating a bard, you choose either you want to be a wordsmith or a troubadour. And then they tell you what kind of spellcasting trait that they have. So this one, it's always presence because it's a bard, right? It's presence itself and stuff like that. And then it gives you different features. So this one is Heart of a Poet, once per short rest. Remember, we talked about that, like things activating only per certain amount of time. When speaking to a person, you're trying to impress, persuade, or offend. If you use at least 3 rhyming words, you may add 1d6 to the action roll against them, or rousing speech once per long rest. You can give a heartfelt, inspiring speech. All allies that can hear you clear a stress.
So these are in addition to, if we scroll back for one, these are in addition to these 2 domains we have right here, Grace and Codex.
Yeah.
And like I said, those are where the cards are going to come from. So you're going to have abilities from those cards as well as these abilities, the foundation features, and eventually you get the specialized features and mastery features. And then each one of the subclasses has their own set of features that they have. So obviously, like Jared just said, the Heart of the Poet and the Rousing Speech is only for the wordsmith. The Trebuchet, the Troubadour, not Trebuchet.
Trebuchet. Yeah, they just launch stuff at you.
Just launching people. The Troubadour doesn't get that. They get a whole new, their own set of abilities.
Mm-hmm. And then when you level, and this is an interesting thing, unlike other systems, when you level, you'll see level 2 to 4, you get to choose a box there. So you permanently add 1 hit point slot, increase 2 experiences by +1, increase your proficiency by +1, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Increase 2 unmarked character traits by +1 and then mark them. Increase your minor damage threshold by 1, right? And so theoretically, you could have 2 bards at the table and look completely different as you level and you play because you're taking different features.
People who play Gloomhaven, and this is going to look very familiar to them because this is a similar system that they did, how the characters kind of customized their own card decks. This is a similar thing where, like, once you take the permanently add 1 hit point slot, you cross that box out. You can't take it again in the 2 to 4 level. And then as you go, there's different choices for 5 to 7. There's different choices for 8 to 10. And this is also how you multi-class. We're not really going to talk about multi-classing, but there is options for it. Then it kind of explains it on the back of the character. This is the second page of the character sheet. So
that was all part 1. Part 1 is like character creation, learning the character sheet. We've kind of gone over how you roll dice, how you score, how you get everything going. Part 2 is basically the point of everything, like the adventuring, what's going on, maps, arrangements, movement, downtime, death. Death isn't just death, by the way. There's multiple things you get to do when you die. So you can embrace death and go out in a blaze of glory. You can avoid death and face consequences, or risk it all. You roll your dice. If hope is higher, you stay on your feet and you clear an amount of hit points equal to the value of the hope die, so you gain life back. If you fear is higher, you die. Avoid death is you kind of drop to 0, and then things get worse. Then you roll your fear die, and if it's equal to or under your level, you take like something called a scar, and then you heal up, or then you could go out in blaze of glory. Like you're just like, oh, I'm done with this character, or it makes logical sense that like my character might not win because he was taking the last stand against a horde of goblins, and I'm just going to go out and blaze glory. And it's told, the GM's expected to allow the player to like explain how they go out. Like they pull the hand grenade and they hold it there, and they scream, for democracy, and then they blow themselves up. That's the premise of death in the game. There's lots of ways in and out and around it. It's not all just like, oh, you hit 0, you drop unconscious. There are different ways to kind of play it out, so you're no longer just sitting there. In combat, and this is kind of, I think, the part that like me and a lot of people get like kind of rushed to is how does combat work? And combat works with actions and an action tracker. And this one is a little heavy. So every time everything happens all at once, there's no initiative, right? Like there's no like, okay, Steve, you go, and then my monster goes, and then Tina goes, and then my 2 other goblins go, and then Zach goes. There's no more of that. Basically what happens is, as we're cooperatively telling the story, Steve says, my wizard cast blah, blah, blah. And he puts down the action token.
Well, the first thing that happens is if the GM thinks that this is going to be this situation, whatever the situation is, doesn't necessarily have to be combat, but whatever the situation is not going to be basically finished in like a die roll or 2, they will place the action tracker out, which indicates to everyone that some action, that something is about to go down.
Yeah.
And then whether the GM or maybe the GM will set the scene and say, hey, the goblins come out and jump you, and there's 35 goblins. What do you guys do? Right? So maybe no one was caught surprised, and then and then the action tracker will come out and will have nothing on it. And then if you want to go to with a...
Oh, yeah. So Steve would say, I cast whatever. He places an action token. Once he places his action token, then I can, as a GM, I can spend it to have my reaction, or I could wait, and then I'm like, okay, that spell put to sleep 3 goblins, but there's 32 more goblins coming at the party, right? Like whatever. And then Tina's like, well, I'm playing the seraph, right? This like divine character, and they're going to do something. So Tina would place an action token. And I'm like, okay, well, that took out 3 more goblins. And I haven't done anything as a GM yet, right? Because it's not my turn. And then Zach's like, well, I'm going to go now. And as the ranger, I'm going to shoot them with my bows. I'm going to like shoot a group with my bow. And I can use one of the tokens that was placed to interrupt their turn and say, okay, before you go, I'm going to do this. Oh, 2 tokens. Sorry, 2 tokens. That's right. That's why I put 2 on the field before I interrupted someone's turn. I used 2 tokens to interrupt the turn. Or remember we talked earlier about the fear and how I was collecting fear. I could spend fear to also take actions as the game master.
Yeah, so the game master, the moment that they place the action board or the action tracker on the field, they can actually spend their own fear tokens to actually add their own tokens to the, because they can only effectively, their fear tokens can let them do a bunch of stuff. But to activate their monsters, they must be spending tokens off the action tracker. So it gives the players an idea of how bad things really are. Because the idea is that the less the players do, in other games, actually board games there's a couple of board games I play that take into this concept, is the more the players do, the more the monsters can do. And the hope is that you do enough to take out so many monsters that even though there's a lot of tokens there, I might not be able to do a lot. Or consider the fact that, wow, Tina just did 2 or 3 actions. Zach did 2 actions. Fabio did 2 actions. I'm like, oh, do I really need to take an action right now? There's a lot of tokens on the field and the GM hasn't done anything yet. I'm getting a little concerned. I may want to see what the GM is going to do with those tokens, and then maybe see if I need to support one of my allies. Or, so this is the game that is in place. But yet again, if it's narratively important, the monsters could start with tokens on the field because, the monsters did surprise you. And then they already have tokens, so that maybe their first action is they act first and they start shooting you with arrows or whatever. Yeah. And then now this back and forth of players add tokens, then the GM can take those tokens, and then sometimes the GM can spend fear to interrupt the player's actions. Like, okay, in the middle of your action, I'm going to do something by spending my fear tokens. It lets me kind of interrupt the flow of the turn. So it's a really interesting concept where this, you have a visible understanding of how much the other side can do. I mean, technically the players can do as much as they want, but then that also means the monsters can do as much as they want too. So it's back and forth.
It also does recommend that the player does not activate the same monster continuously, but
that the GM.
The GM doesn't activate the same monster continuously. Because in my head, right, like the one-eyed floating creature, because like it's distinctively different enough from the beholder.
The two-eyed floating creature.
Yeah, yeah. It has one in the front and one in the back.
One in the back.
Right. Like I want that floating one-eyed ball creature to be the boss monster. You know, like how does that work if I'm only able to activate one? We haven't really looked into like the depths of the monster economy, because we really just kind of went over like character creation, classes, and the general like flow of the game. We haven't like dived into the monster, so that's something I want to see played out more. Also, like I do want to play the free game they give us, so I'll see more as the GM how that works.
So if you are a player,
look away,
and you really want to be surprised by this stuff, and you don't want to look at the adventure, I guess turn away until I don't know. I'll leave a spoiler warning like on the bottom or wherever.
Yeah.
When that goes away, you can look at this again. And then so this is a solo monster, as we were just talking about it, and we said that the game does recommend that the GM does not activate the same monster over and over again, but also the fact that this is a solo monster, you kind of have to, and it has this ability that basically lets it break that rule.
Yeah,
and a number of times per turn.
And then you could see its hit points. 15 is for minor, so dealing 15 points of damage or
does
more only does 1 point of damage.
But it only has 7 hit points.
Yeah.
The hit points numbers are really low, but I do actually appreciate that idea of, instead of having an arbitrarily high number of hit points, the idea of like what constitutes a hit. And also one thing that we didn't go over when talking about hits is anything that's below your minor threshold. So we talked about the bard having a threshold of 3. Anything that's 2 or below, you take a stress unless it's 0 damage.
Another aspect of part 2 is talking about, obviously we were talking about combat and the tracker. So now we're going to kind of talk about like what happens when you hit and weapons and stuff like that. So proficiency denotes how many damage die you roll. So most people start with 1 proficiency, and then that's how many damage dice you roll. So if you go down to the weapon table, there's physical weapons and magic weapons, and you could see the trait that they use. So the trait is the bonus you add to the d12s when you roll, right, to meet that target number, and the damage will tell you the die to roll, and all of them start, obviously it'll just say d10, d8 physical, d10 magic, and then it'll say like some of them will say d10 plus 2, meaning you add obviously plus 2. So proficiency, you can go to a max of 6. So if at the highest tier in the campaign, I might have a 6 proficiency, so I would roll 6d10 to damage. That's how much damage I deal.
So, and here's a question, which you may not know the answer to. If I'm using the battle axe, right, and I have a proficiency of 6, is it 60-10 plus 2 or 60-10 plus 12?
I think it's 60-10
Is it the whole
plus
thing?
2.
Okay, so the 2 doesn't get magnified. It's just the die. Okay.
Yeah. And then there are features, obviously, reliable, +1 to attack rolls with this weapon, light +1 agility, quick, mark of stress to attack an additional target in range. So that's cool. So you can give yourself more stress to attack more enemies, or maybe you're playing a character that already can attack multiple enemies, and then you're like, you know what? I'm just going to go crazy and put like a Tasmanian Devil, if you've ever remembered the Looney Tunes cartoons, and he just swirls, and that's what your character, you're going to build that character. You're like, I'm just going to swirl and be a death tornado.
And then some of them are heavy, like the Warhammer, so it gives you minuses to agility, cumbersome minuses to evasion, so it makes you harder to jump out of the way, which makes sense for a longbow. So there are negative traits and positive traits.
Yeah, and then as you go, they tell you kind of the levels where like you should be getting these kinds of weapons.
Yeah, there's tiers. They use a tier system in this a lot for determining what things you should be doing.
Yeah, so there's like the improved rapier and the gilded falchion. And then you'll start to, like, as you get crazier, you get the legendary battle axe, which is D8 plus 8. So remember how you talked about like what weapon you're using? So theoretically, at higher tier play,
Oh.
you'll have like a legendary weapon, and then you'll have a more plus at the end.
Yeah, I actually was just looking at this. This is interesting. When we talk about magic weapons, we have a different connotation to that than this game is assuming, because a physical weapon is just like a fighter picks up a weapon, or a warrior in this case, picks up a weapon and swings with it. And what we determine a magic weapon is an enchanted weapon that the warrior could pick up and swap with somebody with. So they pick up the magic battle axe, and then now it makes them either more damage or more to hit or whatever. In this one, magic weapons specifically need the ability to cast spells to function. Like arcane gauntlets. So they're magical infused gauntlets that use effectively, I think, your spell ability to attack instead of actually using your physical prowess with the weapon. So that's interesting. So the idea of magic weapons is literally weapons for magic classes instead of a enchanted weapon for anybody to use.
Yeah. So
and then some of these, like wand, uses your knowledge stat.
Yeah.
And then
so
obviously there's ranges here that they use a very similar index card RPG kind of range system. They don't use feat. They actually even mentioned this in the early kind of like introduction to it, where they I think are slightly shying away from the idea of gridded combat into more of like this close, near, far, very far, all that kind of stylized distances instead of like, no, it's 3 squares away.
Yeah.
So
yep. So that's more or less the whole. There's more in it. There's obviously, we didn't get into the minutia of everything. We're trying to keep this short, not kill Steve with editing. But that's all of it. That's a lot of it, right? So we talked about monsters, we talked about proficiency, we talked about how you fight, the action tracker, and all that jazz. So let us know in the comments below. Do the thing, like, subscribe, do whatever. I was supposed to say that in the beginning, but I never say it because I feel like I don't need to pressure people into wanting to see more of our videos. Algorithms! Feed the beast! But with that being said, we are Nothing Venture, Nothing Game. We love rolling dice, giving advice with a little bit of that New York spice. Say goodbye, Steve.
Later.
Bye.